The Guardians of the Galaxy movie series is my favorite movie series in the entire MCU and possibly my favorite movie series of just all time. And it was only into my deep dive on what makes this movie so brilliant and why it's so memorable to me that I realized Guardians of the Galaxy was almost doomed to fail. Okay, doomed to fail might be a little bit of an over-exaggeration, but the MCU today and the MCU back when Guardians of the Galaxy released is completely different. It's night and day, basically. Taking us all the way back to 2012, the Avengers had just made comic book movie history by being one of the first movies to actually feature a whole bunch of different connected movies coming together. And it was also arguably one of the first times ever that nerd culture had sort of blended into the mainstream popularity of the everyday moviegoer. But right as it seemed like the MCU was starting to really get its legs and get going, it almost seemed like it began to crumble just as easily. See, up until this point, the MCU films had followed a pretty strict formula. You focus on one singular main character and how they got their powers, have them go through a challenge with one foe who usually embodied a core part of the main character's psyche, but just mirrored or switched in some sort of way, such as Jeff Bridges in the first Iron Man movie basically being Tony Stark if he continued down his path of being the Merchant of Death, or Red Skull being Captain America's idealism and patriotism for his country if it was just Nazi Germany instead of America. But above all else, one thing that seemed to be consistent, even across movies such as Thor, was keep the story on Earth. In all the crazy, wacky sci-fi shenanigans and big old laser blasts, keep the story grounded on a singular protagonist on Earth, because that was what worked, and movies that had tried to step out of that system, like Thor 2: The Dark World, had been met with middling box office results and even worse critical reviews. So, knowing all of this, what did Guardians of the Galaxy have to do? What did it have to set up for the future and achieve as a movie for the MCU as a whole? A lot. First, it had to establish all 5 characters of the main group all in one movie. There was no time to set up different movies for each of the different characters and then have them all come together for Guardians of the Galaxy. All 5 characters had to be set up immediately in just this one movie. Of course, Peter Quill was going to be the main protagonist and obviously get most of the screen time and backstory, but all of the other characters still had to get enough screen time and enough moments so audiences could latch onto who they were as characters and what they meant for the story as a whole. 2. Introduce the audience once again to the larger realm of space as a whole being a consistent part of the MCU going forward. Planets, galaxies, alien races, all had to be reintroduced to the audience after Thor 2 had sort of dropped the ball on doing this. This doesn't sound like a big deal, but science fiction had generally had a kind of bad rap when it came to movies, and a lot of people found them too confusing or too surrealist to really grasp them and care about the characters in a larger realm that felt like it was galaxies and galaxies and galaxies. 3. It had to introduce Thanos as a future big bad while also still making sure that the villain that the Guardians would actually face, Ronan, still felt like a formidable foe for the group themselves. 4. It had to reintroduce the concept of Infinity Stones. Remember when I said that Thor 2: The Dark World sort of dropped the ball? Yeah. Infinity Stones were attempted to be introduced in that, but it didn't really work well, so audiences needed to be reintroduced to the concept and the idea of what they could actually do. And finally, above all else, they had to manage the humor that audiences had come to expect from MCU movies and more specifically from Chris Pratt, and the more found family sweetness that audiences were coming to expect from this kind of movie. It also had to include the dark, more edgier parts that the MCU was beginning to introduce, starting with Captain America and the Winter Soldier. This was a monumental task. Even if we just break down all of those elements and mathematically work it out, 5 characters, at least 4 or so planets, Ronan, Thanos, the Infinity Stones, throw in Nebula and a few other characters, and it quickly seems to be spelling out a long slog fest of exposition. And a writing hellscape as well. How in the world would this movie possibly cover all of these elements in just 2 hours? Needless to say, screenwriter Nicole Perlman had a lot on her plate, and she was very quickly struggling with all of these elements to include. Even if they could do all of the above, there was no guarantee that it would succeed anyway. The Guardians of the Galaxy were not nearly as popular as Iron Man or Captain America, and it also wasn't just a reboot or a remake of a team that had already existed like the X-Men or the Fantastic Four. It was entirely new and uncharted waters. So it's no surprise that very early on, Nicole Perlman struggled a lot when writing the script, even from basically the very beginning. When she was enrolled in Marvel's screenwriting program in 2009 and chose Guardians of the Galaxy as the story to adapt, she was met with confusion.
About 7 or 8 different unproduced properties that were lesser known that they had in their library. So Guardians was on the list, and I chose Guardians because it felt very science fiction in tone, and I loved the sort of funny vibe of the 2008 reboot of the comic, and it was just Guardians of the Galaxy from there on out.
In between 2009, where Perlman actually started writing the script, and 2011, when she was basically kicked off the project by James Gunn and he came in and rewrote basically the entire movie, she went through 10 different drafts of the script trying to figure out how to make the configuration of everything work. Even some of those earlier drafts, compared to the one that was rewritten by Gunn in 2011, changed dramatically. Perlman investigated a lot of different ideas in terms of which different characters to slot in or slot out with the team. After all, it's no easy task to try to predict what audiences are going to like, especially when there's this huge of a well of information and characters to choose from. What fans of the comics might like, fans of the movies might not like at all. Ultimately, when Gunn came in 2011 and gutted basically the entire project, Perlman had already set her foot down in terms of what to include, the run from the original comic book series. Ultimately, when Gunn stepped in 2011, he kept the characters, the music, and also kept Star-Lord's change to be a more Han Solo type renegade character and the opening with him on this desolate planet, but everything else was effectively reworked, changed, or just cut entirely. By this point, studio executives like Feige were getting nervous. The movie was slated to release in 2 years, and at this point, the constant rewrites and changes had the entire script muddled in developmental hell. Nobody fully understood who to include in this run and how to balance the corny with the more sweet moments. Nobody fully understood what to include in this weird ragtag group of adventurers in space. Aliens are weird, so obviously there's going to be some of that, but how weird is too weird? Where's the line where funny turns to just downright corny? Debates were being held even late into the writing process of whether Rocket should be included at all, and some studio executives were nervous that a talking raccoon would be too much for audiences to get on board with. But this is where Perlman said, "You're keeping Rocket in the movie." And fortunately, Joss Whedon, who was brought in for late-term story rewrites and basically just polishing the script, seemed to agree. After reading one of Gunn's adapted scripts, he said, "Make it weirder." And finally, the stars seemed to align. The movie leaned into the weirdness. Wheels were finally turning. The story was finalized and casting was done. Chris Pratt in the lead role and a bunch of other basically A-list stars voicing various characters or acting alongside him. But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. Costs were ballooning at this point. No matter how much you try to shoot things practically, if you're setting a giant action movie in space, there's going to be a lot of CGI involved, and the budget soon went over what Marvel had agreed upon. Finally, on January 1st, New Year's Day of 2014, this photo was shared. The first look audiences had at their main characters for Guardians of the Galaxy. There was no going back now. A gigantic space opera set across multiple galaxies with a huge cast of characters, fully science fiction setting, huge amounts of setup had to be delivered. Gunn and his team were committed. They waited with bated breaths for audience reactions to roll in. And they were positive, but mixed. Mostly, praise was given to Pratt's casting in the role for the comedic tone that audiences assumed the movie would be going for. Some people gave credit to the rest of the MCU for creating compelling characters out of a womanizer arms dealer and a literal god. Many people were still on the fence, though, about the movie. The movie's greatest strength, its willingness to be weird and lean into the goofy science fiction feeling, similar to Star Wars or Firefly, was also its biggest flaw. Some audience members were turned away by the full science fiction focus the film seemed to be taking, and of course the inclusion of characters like a talking raccoon or a giant tree to be main characters that they were supposed to care for. Rob Berkman on Gizmodo gave his thoughts quite succinctly, saying, "So far, the Marvel movies have had their fair share of comedy, but they've never featured anything quite as silly, goofy, ridiculous, and downright weird as a talking, gun-toting space raccoon.
Why didn't it have to get made?
Hell, think back to how ridiculous Benicio del Toro's space albino was in Thor: The Dark World post-credit scene. That shit is bizarre." Some audience members even thought that the movie was so ridiculous and weird it was going to be some sort of meta-critique on the superhero movie. It also didn't help that audiences had just been introduced to the Avengers 2 years ago. There was confusion over where this new group would even fit in. Are they part of the Avengers? Would they even end up crossing paths? Or was this some sort of fractured timeline that didn't directly connect into the rest of the MCU? And also, did I mention the talking raccoon and that it's all in space? Finally, it hits August 1st, 2014. Audiences flock to see if this will be a roller coaster of fun or a messy disappointment. And
here comes the money.
the movie's a blast. Guardians of the Galaxy smashes the box office and proves the naysayers wrong. In the end, it grossed $770 million against a budget of only $230 million. But this wouldn't have happened if the movie hadn't been perfect with its handling of all of these elements. And there's surprisingly a large amount of tact and nuance being placed beneath the hood on this sci-fi romp from beginning to end. And now let's jump into the movie itself and talk about what I like so much about this movie. The opening scene for Guardians of the Galaxy is one of the best examples I have ever seen about humanizing a character to the audiences while also setting up future plot points and flaws. The solitary image of Peter with his Walkman looking dejected and sad as there are no adults around him already begins to make us humanize with the character for his feeling of isolation. Immediately, we begin to understand who he is as a character. His reluctance to go into his mom's room at the start of the scene reveals a core tenet of his character. He runs from danger. Rather than face it head on, he instead seems to almost have to be physically forced to move forward and take his mom's hand. And when Peter soon after that has to watch his mom literally die right in front of him, we immediately understand that this moment will serve as one of the biggest for his character. It feeds back into his avoidance of problems that are bigger than himself. He can't accept responsibility or handle his emotions and instead hides behind his music or running. This moment also begins to actually set up for the sequel, even though I'm not even sure if it had been greenlit at this point.
So like your daddy. And he was an angel.
With a mention from Peter's mom about Peter's father being an angel, but her seeming lucidness and everything else, we, along with Peter, begin to wonder if what she's saying actually has potentially some truth behind it. The gift from Peter's mom also serves as a MacGuffin that we know will come back into the story later. Gunn's insistence to have Peter not open the present here or in later scenes shows us that it will be important by the end of the movie. As Peter runs out of the hospital, once again showing his avoidance issues to problems that are bigger than himself, he immediately gets caught in a tractor beam of the ship. And the apparent size of the beam and ship brings us, along with Peter, directly full-on headfirst into the space-themed elements of the movie. See, Peter as the protagonist, but also as a human, often serves as the character the audience will see to be introduced to the impossibly large frontier of space. Gunn isn't just grounding the story by having a human be the main character, but he's also allowing Peter to be taken out of his domestic life, much in the same way that we will be whisked away into space almost immediately and basically never go back to Earth or a planet that doesn't immediately stick out like a sore thumb. What's even more amazing as the story goes on is that Gunn gives Peter a perfect reason to not already know all of the information that other characters tell him and by extension us, the audience. He always chooses to run from danger, and he's been raised by a band of mercenaries. He can't accept responsibility for problems bigger than himself, so why ever learn about them or care? When we cut to the desolate planet years later, Gunn is forcing us to either get on his wacky science fiction comedy rocket ship or get left behind. Lack of any montage scenes of Peter as he's growing up means that, like Peter, we will have to try and take things as they come throughout the movie, piecing together other characters' backstory and motivations as it comes to Peter and by extension us through little droplets and hints given throughout the movie. It's important to note here that so far this movie has a depressingly dark tone. Unlike what the poster and trailer seem to promise, so far it seems like this movie is going to be depressing as hell from start to finish. In less than 10 minutes, we've had a parent die, a child not get to say goodbye to them, and then he gets kidnapped. And even to cut forward into space, it makes us start on a cold, desolate planet. Peter's first introduction as an adult doesn't dissuade this tone immediately either. Against the backdrop of this dark planet, his bright red eyes on his mask make him look almost like a villain. Has Gunn been tricking us the whole time? Is Peter actually going to be a villain or an antagonist, and the movie is only showing us this backstory so that we can sympathize with him? The audience waits, curious and confused, to see exactly how this character who has gone through so much at so young of an age has handled it all. And then those feelings of the dark tone are immediately nullified when Peter puts on his headphones and we see him begin to lackadaisically make his way through this random cave. The upbeat song and his carefree dance moves make him seem like he hasn't got a care in the world. Even the song seems to be a direct reference to Peter's behavior and mental state. Come and Get Your Love makes us understand that Peter is probably more of a lover than a fighter. He's carefree, going about the world he lives in with a hedonistic lifestyle, doing anything, or rather, anyone he thinks will bring him joy. As the scene goes on though, there are a couple elements that hint that Peter probably isn't quite as confident as he might seem to be. For example, in this scene where he jumps a small pit with his rocket boots, he lands and stumbles a little bit, showing us that beneath that exterior of carefree confidence and charisma, there's probably more going on, and that he's figuring out where he fits into the grand scale of this universe. Then the music abruptly cuts out to reveal what Peter is here to try and get: this orb. Immediately, we know that this thing is going to be very important for the rest of the story, given how much protection is seemingly placed around it. And also due to the fact that immediately after this, we see a whole nother group land on this planet and come searching for Peter and the orb. As the conversation between Peter and, Horath the Pursuer? We're once again being told that Peter is nothing more than a small fish in a big pond. He's not a Captain America or an Iron Man, someone who has been born or gifted with this natural skill or ability that make him superior than everybody else.
Hey, you know what? There's another name you might know me by. Star-Lord. Who?
Ooh, you're odd.
His name is laughed at, and as the fight continues on, Peter doesn't dispose of his foes with a practiced efficiency, but instead seems to be barely able to eke out and scrape by the skin of his teeth. Once again, Gunn is reinforcing that even after all of these years, Peter is still, at his heart, running from danger. More than that though, Gunn is showing us Peter's skills. He may not be the most powerful or the most rich person in the entire galaxy, but he uses the tools and what he has at his disposal to get by. His incompetence is also shown basically just as much as his skills. He doesn't even remember that he has someone else in his ship, and he very nearly almost dies multiple times in this chase scene just trying to get away with this orb. These opening scenes are already accomplishing a lot of what the Guardians of the Galaxy movie had to do. We've already scratched off one of our 5 characters and their backstory, the Infinity Stone, the tone of the movie being both dark and comedic, the expansive world of space, and also the narrative reasons why we are in the story at this point. There's clearly a power vacuum that this orb solves. Whoever gets this orb probably will hold some sort of power over the entire galaxy, if not the entire universe. Peter, the Ravagers, this Korath guy, and as we'll see in just a few moments, Nebula, Gamora, Ronan, Thanos, etc., all want this orb for a variety of reasons. All of that in less than 20 minutes.
You know what I see? Losers.
When crafting in an ensemble cast, one of the largest difficulties is making each character have a moment to shine without outshining somebody else. While earlier on in the movie, we see each of the characters apart from Drax attempting to get the orb, and they display some of their skills, this mostly just boils down to being a bunch of random science fiction technology and doesn't really show off a whole lot of each character. In fact, it's one of my least favorite scenes in the entire movie, despite the fact that there are some funny moments.
Hey, that isn't Star Prince.
Star-Lord.
But if we take a look at one of the following sequences, the prison scenes, it offers the perfect opportunity for Gunn to show off not just each character's biggest strength, but also mostly their biggest weakness as well. Before the crew have even gotten put into their prison's holding cell, we can see that Peter's attachment and impulsivity to protect the things he cares about has a downside, which makes him not be able to think clearly. He gets wrapped up in his emotions too easily. Immediately going in and attempting to get back his walkman without any sort of weaponry while still being handcuffed goes to show his impulsivity and childlike naivety, but that he's gotten so used to getting out of scrapes with his luck to back it up that he hasn't really faced any big failures. Interestingly, this is contrasted in the later scene where Gamora is almost stabbed, where
Oh crap. You know, if killing Ronan is truly your sole purpose, I don't think this is the best way to go about it.
Peter's able to quickly think of a way to defuse the situation, and even how he's able to get the prosthetic leg that Rocket needs him to get. Peter is able to be pragmatic, calculated, and a leader when he isn't at personal risk of dying, or the problem isn't something that's directly emotionally attached to him.
What has the galaxy ever done for you? Why would you want to save it? Because I'm one of the idiots who lives in it!
Peter's strength is his emotions and his ability to be able to sweet talk and come up with ingenious solutions, but this also often lands him in a lot of troubles and fights that he doesn't have a good shot at winning. Gamora, on the other hand, seems to almost have the opposite problem. She has arguably the best physical, actual fighting skills out of the group, being a master with swords and hand-to-hand combat, but she lacks the ability and tact to use her words to de-escalate problems. She's an instigator who believes that she will always be able to get out of things alone and doesn't need to rely on other people. The fight scenes show her impressive ability to handle foes, but her almost getting stabbed in the previous night go to show her biggest flaw. She's so untrusting and uncompromising in her belief that she is always right that she's unable to swallow her pride even when it's clear it will probably end up with her getting killed if she doesn't. Rocket's strength and flaw is perhaps the easiest out of all of the members except Groot to distinguish.
I've escaped 22 prisons. This one's no different.
He says it himself. He's escaped from multiple prisons, and we always see him tinkering with something. His strength is his ability to use his intelligence to think his way out of problems, similar to Peter, but his is a lot more focused on creating devices or physical objects, while Peter is a lot more emotionally driven. But his biggest weakness is being able to see past himself and the problems he is immediately facing. He tries to stop Quill from going after Gamora when she is taken away, unable, like Peter is, to see the bigger picture. He's pragmatic, but only with issues that concern himself. In some ways, he is the antithesis of Quill, able to see the big picture when problems concern himself, but unable to see it when the problem and the solution doesn't immediately benefit him. Groot's biggest strength is that
I'm Groot.
And his biggest weakness is that
I'm Groot.
Finally, the last person to round off the group, and the last one to be introduced, Drax the Destroyer. Drax's biggest strength is also his biggest weakness. He lets his emotions guide him at all times. Most of the time, Drax's biggest strength is the fact that he's willing to basically go along with whatever Peter says for him to do because he has a level of respect for Peter. Seeing Peter's combat skills and the fact that Peter is usually a way for him to achieve his goals. Why think for himself if he can get all that he wants in life by just following what someone else tells him. But I'm sure you can also come to see that this has its downsides. In this movie, that's mainly due to the fact that what is higher than his emotional attachment towards Peter and the group is his grief and anger at Thanos for killing his wife and child. When Peter uses Thanos against Drax before he's about to kill Gamora, it shows the positives of this from Peter's perspective. His hate for Thanos supersedes his hate for Gamora. But when he gets to Nowhere and sees the opportunity to directly call Ronan the direct underling of Thanos, we begin to see the problems with this way of thinking. This action almost ultimately results in Peter or Gamora almost dying. Drax is a path of least resistance guy, using his emotions, or rather what other people tell him, to choose where he should go and what he should do at all times. Remember how earlier I said the monumental task that Guardians of the Galaxy had to do? Guardians of the Galaxy does this partially by delicately using a plot-telling device. Exposition. I'm sure we've all seen movies where it seems like every character is just telling a character something that they should have already known, but the audience needs to know the information too. It's boring and it's lazy, but it seems almost necessary with a movie like Guardians and how much it had to cram in. But like I mentioned before, James Gunn expertly uses all of this information and weaves it into the story through way of Peter. Rather than having a scene where Quill sits down and learns all about Thanos or one of the other team members by sitting down and just having a long conversation with them, Gunn instead weaves in bits and pieces throughout the entire movie, subtly planting ideas in our heads so the audience doesn't just feel like they're being smacked with a giant amount of exposition, but instead hungering to learn more. Take for example this earlier scene where Quill goes to try and give this guy the orb.
What is it? Yeah, well, I almost died getting it for you.
An occupational hazard, I'm sure.
Quill asks two questions. One, what is the orb? And two, who wants it? Now, the cheap way would be to have this guy talk all about who Thanos is and how all the Infinity Stones work, and tell Peter that this is an Infinity Stone that was created years and years and blah, 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 blah. But instead, we see him immediately try to force Peter out of the building.
Who's Ronan?
A Kree fanatic, outraged by the peace treaty, who will not rest until Xandarian culture, my culture, is wiped from existence.
We learn bits and pieces about Ronan, but not immediately enough to feel like we've learned all there is to know about the character. For example, we don't learn why he wants the orb or what he plans to do with it. Gunn also doesn't answer the other question that Peter asked.
What is it?
By giving part of this answer to one question and not giving an answer at all to the other, continues to seed questions in the viewer's mind. They're hungering, just like Peter is, for an answer to all of these things that they find themselves in direct confrontation with. Gunn uses this answer one question but not the other quite a few more times throughout the film. He uses it in Gamora's introduction at the prison, telling us that Gamora's relation to Thanos is an adopted daughter, which solidifies her earlier introduction scene, but also makes us ask the question, who is Gamora's biological father, and what happened to them? You can extrapolate this way of delivering exposition to basically any scene where we learn something about one of the characters, a planet, some piece of history, etc. Ask two questions, but only answer one or one and a half at most. The other way Gunn weaponizes exposition to make it digestible for the audience is with what I like to call the Mary Poppins method. You know the good old adage,
A spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down.
Well, in this case, the medicine is just big explosions or escalating tension or a giant planet basically exploding. For example, at one of the largest exposition dumps in the whole movie, where Gunn can't really ask two questions, we learn what an Infinity Stone is, how it works, and what happens when someone who is not strong enough to hold the Infinity Stone tries to hold it. This is mostly a really big long speech by the Collector, but as it continues on, we can see that the Collector's assistant is slowly inching towards the Infinity Stone right as we're learning about just how destructive and powerful it is. The alluring purple draws her and the audience by extension in, almost like watching a car crash in slow motion. We're begging for anyone to just look the other way and see her, stop her, but it's all too late. Because the minute she grabs that stone, it leads into arguably, I think, one of the best action sequences in this entire movie, if not the MCU as a whole. Giant purple blasts explode out of the stone, causing the whole building to begin to topple and burn. Immediately after this, it seems like we are about to get another bunch of exposition about the orb as the crew all make their way out, only to instead see the results of the tension from Drax's mysterious Zoom call earlier when Ronan comes in to try to get the orb. Only now, the audience has a full understanding of the power, and so every moment where the crew almost loses it and Ronan almost gets it feels much heavier because we know exactly what will happen if he gets his hands on it. While I couldn't find a really catchy way to title this one of my favorite things about Guardians of the Galaxy is its willingness to just throw everything out the window and subvert expectations. By this point, there were enough superhero movies out there for audiences to kind of be able to predict what was going to happen. They'll team up and they'll save a bunch of people, and there isn't really a way for Gunn to get around that because that's just how basic story works. But what Guardians does do is subvert other moments throughout the movie so that expectations all throughout the movie keep getting proven wrong and keeps the audience on their toes. Peter's lack of skill in a lot of moments and reliance instead to rely on luck or thinking up weird, odd solutions to problems, the fact that at the end Groot doesn't really die, and a plethora more are all great moments of expectations being subverted. But I want to focus on one moment in Guardians that I would argue is possibly the saddest in the entire film and is probably my favorite scene in the entire movie. Because to me, the saddest scene in the entire movie is not Peter's mom dying, but instead the romantic scene where Gamora discovers why Peter likes music so much. First, everything about this romantic scene at nowhere seems like it's going to go directly into a generic first kiss moment between the protagonist and his love interest. The beautiful sky behind them, the isolation and the fact that it's just the two of us, and even the diegetic music and talk of dancing. All of it feels like we are heading straight to Kissy Town. Instead, I think that this subversion ends up creating a much deeper and more personal connection between Peter and Gamora than a kiss ever could, by using shared trauma and a connection of both characters through music as a way for them to connect. First, Peter's introduction about both of their skill sets lightens the mood.
It's just a negotiation tactic. Trust me, this is my specialty. Where yours is more stab, stab. Those are my terms.
But it also serves as a moment of humility for him. We've seen before that he generally just sort of treats his lovers as disposable, even going so far as to forget one of them was on his ship. In this moment, though, he concedes that Gamora is the better fighter of the two, and that his skills lie much more in talking than fighting. And this doesn't seem like a pickup line. It seems like an actual admiration of her skills and validation of her own beliefs that she is the strongest and most capable out of all of the team. As we get to learn more about Gamora's backstory, and she asks Peter,
"Why would you risk your life for this?"
we can tell it's an attempt at Gamora to put some trust into Peter, something that he stressed just a few short minutes earlier.
If we're gonna work together, you might want to try trusting me a little bit.
And how much do you trust me?
We've seen a few moments pop up earlier where characters have mentioned or done something related to the Walkman or music, but when Peter delivers this simple line,
My mother gave it to me. Mom liked sharing with me all the pop songs that she loved growing up. I happen to have it on me. When I was... the day that she...
it feels like, perhaps for the first time in the entire movie, Peter is actually being honest with someone in his adult life. He's bearing his soul. Just as Gamora is letting down her own guard to tell Peter about her backstory, he's reciprocating and reaching out to her, and even allowing her to hold and listen to the Walkman and the music. He's not just sharing his music taste, he's sharing his entire soul with this woman. Gamora then seems to begin to put her walls back up, by saying that she doesn't dance and beginning to move away from Peter. But Peter continues to try to share his soul with her as he places his headphones on her, and for a brief moment, everything else seems to just fall away. Instead, leaving us with just these two wayward souls who have found themselves, right in this moment, sharing with each other. This is probably the first time in both of their lives they've met someone that they think they might be able to have an actual real-life connection with. Gamora lets her guard down a little bit more by allowing Peter to put his headphones on her, and connects with Peter even deeper by breaking that physical touch barrier, where she allows him to hold her as they begin to dance. But finally, just as they are about to kiss, all of Gamora's walls come right back up. Instead, she retaliates, taking out one of her knives and almost stabbing Peter, and she rejects Peter's advances. Peter's comment right after, explaining himself by saying,
That is not what's happening.
they're both reaching out, and we as the audience understand that both of them need each other, and they have developed this deep connection. But both of their reputations and self-identities, Gamora feeling the need to keep herself closed off, and knowing Peter's reputation for being a womanizer and basically just moving from woman to woman, it makes them feel like they have conflict, even if they don't. Guardians of the Galaxy is a movie that I could probably talk about for an hour, if I had the time to and I knew people would watch. I had to cut an entire portion of this video out where I talk about how the ending dance battle shows off more of Peter's strengths, but suffice it to say, this movie deserves all of the love that it has gotten. The undertaking and skill that Gunn and Perlman had to wield this movie and make this movie work just as well is enormous. Not everyone can exceed at doing all of this in just one movie. There have been multiple movies since this, both in and outside of the MCU, that have tried to take on the task of forming an entire team or introducing other concepts, and they've all basically fallen flat on their face. This movie was Marvel's one to fail, and yet it ended up being one of the most critically and audience acclaimed movies in the entire MCU. Whether you've seen it recently or just when it came out, what were your thoughts on it? Leave me a comment down below and I'll try to respond. I also want to say a big thank you to all of you guys for 100 subscribers. If you liked this video or any of the other content on my channel, then consider subscribing. I'm trying to get to 1,000 subscribers by the end of this year, and I will see you in the next video. It's looking like it will either be about I Saw the TV Glow or A Quiet Place. I haven't fully finalized my decision. Bye-bye.